My name is Stathis Michailidis. I'm a professor of engineering and a fellow of the Institute, and I'm in charge of the weather. But I'd like to introduce our last panel here. The panel is going to be on sustainability, which is essentially the main reason many of us are here. It is going to be moderated by Megan Hayes, who is the managing director on Kimmeridge Public Investment Team, and before she worked for Cimarex Energy and for Concho Resources. We're very proud that she studied political science at TCU, so she's a horned frog, and she also has a certificate in public health from Harvard. She will introduce the panel.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I do hope you took Anne up on the offer to enjoy a beverage while we talk about how it's not easy being green or achieving sustainability. I do want to lean on the presentation that Rob West provided earlier today when he said we're on track by his forecast to underinvest by $1 trillion in energy. And the punchline there was that portends energy scarcity and a price supercycle. But we have on our panel today folks that represent energy that is affordable and abundant, and in one instance achieving a breakthrough to be on a path to do that in our lifetime, which probably is a running joke that I'm sure Andrew will touch on in a minute, that it's always, nuclear fusion's always 40 years out on the horizon, or 50, pick your decade. But it's complex and it's messy, and I think that's one of the big things we've been able to take away from all of the speakers today. And so with that, I'd love for each of our panelists to walk through and help us set the stage for this panel today by giving us your background and telling us what it means in your world to achieve sustainability or be green. John, we'll start with you.
My name is John DiDonato. I work for NextEra Energy Resources. I am in charge of the national origination for renewable projects, wind, solar, storage. That means that we work with customers, we identify demand, we turn our teams in the direction, therefore, to get land rights and support projects that will then satisfy that demand. I'm a 20-plus year veteran of renewable energy. Was doing it in that early stage that Eric showed, where it wasn't that attractive, but we kept going, and now we've got something that I think a lot of people are interested in. So you ask, what does sustainability look like to NextEra Energy? And Eric showed some of that from the Florida Power and Light standpoint, but our company has now put forth a vision that we call Real Zero. And Real Zero simply means that rather than become net zero, we have a vision and we see a future in which we can actually emit nothing. And we have a process that we believe we're going to follow in order to achieve that. We're first going to take carbon out of the Florida Power and Light system. So all of those projects that Eric was showing you are part of that process. And that requires 90,000 megawatts of solar. And we happen to be in the Sunshine State. Pretty good spot for solar, but as Eric said, it's also very efficient and affordable for our customers, and it adds to the reliability of the system. But once we do that, or while we're doing that, the side of the business that I represent, we call the non-regulated side. It's really the regulated outside of Florida side, because as we know, all of this is regulated in one way or another. But outside of Florida, we plan to take what we've learned from Florida Power and Light and turn that into opportunities for all of our customers and for the country. And you just mentioned underinvestment in energy. We think that it's a $2 trillion opportunity just to decarbonize the energy industry in the United States. And that looks like a variety of things. There are bridge opportunities. Carbon capture may be a bridge, it may be a long-term thing, we don't know. We don't actually own projects that emit a lot of pollutants or a lot of carbon. So again, we're focused on real zero, not net zero. We've done 30,000 megawatts of wind and solar in the 22 years that I've been at the company. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in much of that. So we're going to take that learning and we're going to use it as much as we can. We're going to fill it with, and I talked about this last year, and now we have an even cleaner vision for that. Energy storage in its variety of forms can get us very close, but not all the way. And then we think hydrogen will be commercially available, an affordable opportunity to take us the rest of the way. And the third prong then, so we decarbonize Florida Power and Light, we decarbonize the energy industry, and then we together decarbonize the rest of the US economy. That's another $2 trillion opportunity. So there's plenty of opportunity for capital to be invested in this. That is a long horizon. That doesn't happen overnight, but it requires a lot of things to happen now, and for us to leverage what we've done over the past 2 decades, over the next 2+ decades, in order to be a serious player in that.
Hi, everyone. My name's Tanya Hendricks. I work at a company called Project Canary. I'm the Chief Commercial Officer. I lead everything customer-facing, so sales, marketing, customer success, and our field operations. I'm guessing most folks here probably aren't familiar with Project Canary. We're a Denver-based firm. I'm actually in Austin, though, so I came up for the day. And Project Canary does 2 main things. So one, we have a combination of hardware, software services that does methane detection and monitoring continuously, continuous emission monitors at a variety of facilities. We do a lot at upstream oil and gas sites, but we also have midstream compressor stations. We do landfills, city gate, utilities, and other places where there's methane leaks. So that's one piece of what we do. And then the other thing that we do is an environmental risk audit or environmental risk assessment. And essentially this is coming in and looking at operations like kind of doing a financial audit, but doing it from an environmental lens. So looking at 4 different areas, air, land, water, community, and how the facility is addressing each of those aspects in what they're doing, how it was designed, the controls and governance that are there, and the operating procedures. So those are the 2 services that we offer. And when I think about the role, kind of what sustainability looks like for the energy ecosystem, we really emphasize the word decarbonization, which you just mentioned a lot, which is great, versus energy transition. Transition refers you're moving away from something, and as we really emphasize today, right, it's an and. We still haven't even diminished our coal usage as a globe, right? So thinking about an energy decarbonization, and Project Canary helps companies measure the size of the problem. You know, they're putting out goals and trying to figure out how to decarbonize, but you have to start with understanding what's our starting point, where are we today? And so that's where we come into play. And the other thing that we help with that I haven't actually heard come up today is, we've talked a lot about the capital markets and being reluctant, and not investing properly in the energy community. And the other thing that's a part of that, though, is the insurance community. And so for those who may be not as familiar, the oil and gas community here in the United States is largely underwritten from an insurance perspective out of Europe. And, we had inbound questions coming into Project Canary saying, hey, we're trying to insure this industry, and we're getting squeezed by these regulators in Europe who regulate our activities and say, what are you doing to greenify your insurance portfolio? And putting a lot of pressure to move away from oil and gas underwriting. And so they've been able to use, and we've been working with them on some education around what's actually happening in the US and how can they use our environmental risk assessments and, methane detection and monitoring to prove back to their regulators that, hey, there's reductions happening, there's good things happening here. And you might have seen recently, like Chubb actually recently came out with a statement. They're going to continue to insure the energy sector, but they're requiring goals and reductions on the emissions profile, which is great because a lot of other companies have actually said, we're just going to exit entirely. So that's definitely one of the things that we've been working on from a Project Canary standpoint to help support the sustainability of the industry.
Well, thank you all. It's great to be with you all here. It's always hard to be the last panel of the day, so I don't want to. I hope you have gotten your drinks and everything, because we're going to talk fusion energy now. I have a friend who works in the energy industry in Houston, and I used to do work around renewables as well, and he would tell me, when you're ready to talk real energy, come to Texas. And so let's talk real energy. What is fusion? Fusion is getting plasma up to a temperature of over 100 million degrees C, confining it inside of either very large magnets or very powerful lasers or some combination of those two ways of doing it, and then creating those fusion conditions, the combination of temperature, pressure, and time. You get fusion. Fusion is a nuclear reaction that happens in the sun. This is the universe's way of making energy. All of us come from fusion reactions. Everything you see, all the elements on Earth, come ultimately from fusion reactions in stars. So it's nature's way of doing energy, and ultimately, we think it's the way that humanity will do all of its energy, whether it's 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years away. Fusion energy is the ultimate resource. It's the way to get there and to have ultimate energy abundance. You know, we can't say it's fully renewable because there's only about 4 billion years of fuel on Earth, but it's getting there. So what's happened, and Megan alluded to this, there's been a big change. In December of last year, at the National Ignition Facility in Lawrence Livermore National Lab in California, for the first time ever, the most powerful lasers on Earth, all focused on a tiny little BB-sized pellet, and got more energy out of the reaction than went into it. Now, it's not commercially relevant yet. Those lasers took a lot more energy than to amplify it, and it only happened once instead of the 10 times a second that it would probably need to happen in a power plant. But it is, we stand right now in the equivalent of, say, 1904 after the Wright brothers' flight in 1903. It is that big of a deal. It is that big of a game-changing moment. And Megan also alluded to the long-time joke of 40 years away, 50 years away, all these sorts of things. And fusion has been going on, fusion research has been going on for that long. I have a picture that on one of the slide decks I show of Queen Elizabeth touring one of the earliest fusion experiments in London, and it's a young Queen Elizabeth. If you've watched The Crown, it's the young, the first season Queen Elizabeth, not the end. So it is. This is something that's been going on for a long time. It's always turned out to be harder than we thought, and that's another thing I want you to leave with. I'm not overpromising here. Fusion is hard. Fusion is hard. Fusion is hard. Replicating the sun on Earth isn't easy because we can't replicate the gravity of the sun. So you have to do it in other ways. But science is progressing. What's happened in the last 10 years is that we've taken all of the breakthrough scientific advances you've seen in everything, from everything that's in your phones, in artificial intelligence, in the manufacturing processes, and all of these really important things that have enabled all these other technological advances. Startup companies have said, wait a second, could we apply that to the greater understanding of plasma physics that we've built up over those 60 years and maybe do this faster, cheaper, better, in a more business relevant way? And the answer's been yes. And so they went out to capital markets and have raised money off of this. And I started the Fusion Industry Association. Several of the companies asked me to kind of put together an association in Washington. And when I started this 2 years ago, it was 24 companies, 3 of which were board member companies, so with the resources to actually stand the thing up. And there was about $1.8 billion invested in the fusion industry. Now, not even 2 years later, we're over $5 billion invested in the private fusion industry, and we have 36 member companies. And that's not even including some that left, some that have gone out of business. The nature of startups is that not everything will work. You shouldn't expect that all 36 will be the businesses that produce fusion energy. But the thing that we're so excited about is that we are now moving and building the proof of concept machines, the machines that will show that fusion can be commercially relevant. They're being built right now in this country, in Boston, in Southern California, in Washington State. I'm actually traveling down to Austin tomorrow and seeing one of the labs at a spin-off from UT Austin. These things are happening all around the country, and there's going to be a race. And so all of them really think that we can get there in the early 2030s. We can get to fusion electricity onto the grid from pilot plants in the early 2030s. And then that means that the decade of the 2030s and into the 2040s is the scale-up time period. That's when we're going to scale up. We're going to really, push this around the world. And then that's what's going to make the impact on how to deal with the huge energy security, reliability, and climate challenges that we all face. It's a really exciting time. I hope I can be a bit of an evangelist here and get you all to see that this is something that's coming. It may not be felt in our day-to-day lives yet, just like in 1904, nobody knew about airplanes yet, but it's coming, and it's going to change everything.
That's a great overview. Thank you, Andrew. So if we pick our energy supply mix, if you leverage any one of the agencies that generates this or your own research, you'll see a base wedge of supply from conventional projects. And what we've learned today is that those conventional projects need to be run, and they need to be run well in order to be essential to the energy transition. And so, Tanya, I'd like you to run with that. How does Project Canary ensure that the gas supply being produced domestically or perhaps internationally as well is safe, clean, and reliable? What are the technological advantages that Project Canary affords operators?
Sure, yep. It's an exciting topic. I'm always amazed at all the different things, technologies that are being used and creative ways to rethink, the decades of investment in a type of way a well pad was created and designed, and now trying to change that and take out all the emissions. So, we see, first of all, when we put the devices out there, right, companies, there's no sort of ground truth today for what methane is actually on the site. And so I tell customers always, look, you're gonna learn something. You're gonna learn something about your operations, you're gonna learn something about your equipment. And so it starts with sometimes simple things of training humans differently, open thief hatches, let's make sure they're closed, like different things. Also looking at maintenance of equipment, valves and tanks and different things like that. So those start to get addressed. And there's actually a really good paper put out by Cheniere that's looked at this at a wide swath of not just using continuous emission monitors, but even having flyovers and different types of ad hoc monitoring over a 9-month period. They see reductions from the beginning to the end, and those reductions get sustained because people can see the difference and see what has to change. But then going forward, you can eliminate a certain percentage of low-hanging fruit, and then you get into harder things. And that's where, as we start to, continue to drill new pads and new wells, thinking about how to redesign the whole system. So putting centralized tank battery sites and then only having wellheads at those remote locations feeding into it, doing more closed-loop systems, putting solar panels on site, taking, there's a technology company called Q Energy, which takes the vented methane, converts it into electricity, and then uses that to power site. So just a lot of different technologies that we're seeing that, there's investment in that and in putting those into play in the field. And that's where it gets to just the energy source that's there today, we can still use it, but we are decarbonizing it over time.
We've talked some today about energy return on energy invested, but I think it's also important to look at the methane intensity across the energy value chain. I'm curious, John and Tanya, how you think about the comparability of a methane intensity across the value chain. Is everybody speaking the same language when they're comparing, a wellhead methane intensity to an LNG cargo ship methane intensity?
I don't think they're speaking the same language. I don't think we're speaking the same language here, frankly. But, again, we are working with a lot of large oil and gas majors right now who are focused on that in their net zero. That is critical to their net zero opportunities. And we're learning. We're learning quite a bit about it. And, our job is to then somehow come up with a solution for them that's actually commercial and has a potential for us to make money. So as we stepped out, we were a partner in coal at the Florida Power and Light System years ago. We're now out of that. So our focus has shifted toward becoming the solution provider for that. And fortunately, we have the luxury of not thinking about it being our own issue. I'd be interested to hear what you said.
Sure, yeah. So methane intensity, there's different ways to calculate it. So it's not always clear what algorithm folks are actually using. And then there's different data inputs that go into it. So is it an estimated one off of taking your source inventory of equipment and applying emissions-based factors to it? Or is it actually a measured one where you've put valves and meters and measured what the methane is? So it is apples, oranges, and bananas today, and it gets even more confusing when you start to go from upstream to midstream to LNG. But it's also pretty new. And one of the things, Eric, that I really appreciated about your presentation was you kept saying a march. It's a march. It's a march. And I feel like there's been a lot of pressure on the energy industry to make it a light switch flip, and not give it that time. So it's pretty new. The governments are now starting to step in and say, okay, we need to have a standard for what we mean when we say methane intensity. And one of the other things, thinking about LNG and the coal to gas switching, we have a policy team that's been spending a fair amount of time in the EU, and they're looking at putting guidelines out for methane intensity on gas imports. And we're trying to guide them, and I think this is where they want to go too, is if the US puts out a good standard, they'll just adopt that and take that and say, okay, fine, if it's meeting the standard in that home country, we will take that then as an import into Europe. So it's great. I think there's progress there to get some alignment on the vernacular.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, switching gears to the Inflation Reduction Act, can you talk about how Congress has incentivized research and development in the nuclear space?
Yeah. So both Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure bill both provide pretty significant incentives to clean energy, various sources of clean energy projects, and everything like that. The most important thing for the fusion industry, and they actually provided some direct dollars in the Inflation Reduction Act to research and development that went straight to the Office of Science, who then turned around and sent it straight to ITER, the research fusion plant in the south of France. So it is maybe that wasn't our best energy return on investment for our companies, but the Inflation Reduction Act really is important because it is a technology neutral tax credit. And that's what is so important. It doesn't need to say, okay, this much for nuclear, this much for fusion, this much for solar, this much for wind, which is how it was before. Now it says it's either a production tax credit or an investment tax credit. You get to choose which one's the appropriate one for you. And if you prove that you are a zero carbon emission, fusion's a zero carbon emission, it doesn't matter what the technology is. In a lot of ways, it doesn't matter for us, for our companies. It doesn't matter whether you're a laser company or a magnetic fusion company or any of the other ones. It just matters that you're zero carbon. And having that certainty provides that certainty to investors. And I'd actually point to another area out of Washington as well for certainty for investors here, because as startup companies, they're all out pitching investors. They're all looking for more money. We've got $5 billion overall in the industry. We need a lot more of that in the next decade to get to those pilot plants. $5 billion doesn't get you there. So we need to keep raising more money, both public and private. The Inflation Reduction Act tax credits get you some of that certainty there. The second thing is we heard earlier from TerraPower about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Nuclear Regulatory Commission just 2.5 weeks ago put out a decision saying that fusion will not be regulated in the same regime as fission. Fusion will be regulated under the Part 30 byproduct material approach, which is different. What that means is day to day, what that means, it'll be regulated by agreement states. It'll be regulated by the states. It won't be the NRC that you have to go through for this 5-10 year long process to get there. It'll be more like a medical isotope facility or an accelerator facility. It's really important for this certainty because it means that fusion companies can iterate much faster. They don't have to wait for those licenses to just build prototypes. So we can build prototypes much faster, and when you build faster, you can learn faster, you can do more, and it's just I can't underline how important this is for us, and we wanted to get out from under what our cousins in fission have to deal with, and it's the right choice too, also because the risks to fusion are just so different from fission. Fusion literally physically cannot melt down. The thing to remember about fusion is that it's very hard to start and it's very easy to stop. Fission is easy to start and hard to stop. And that's what the regulator cares about, and that's where things are. So exciting stuff coming out of Washington. I'm still working on appropriations and public-private partnerships and all that sort of stuff. Still more work to be done, but exciting times.
John, how has the IRA and the Infrastructure Act influenced your capital investment outlook?
So we had a robust outlook before. We were a little worried about the long-term viability of new wind projects because the production tax credit was the first thing that was about to roll off. Fast forward to September after the law was enacted. We have never had more than 4 years of visibility in any of the renewable space, wind, solar, storage. We now have arguably 25 years of visibility. And it's a luxury now that we're going to be able to invest in, the supply chain is going to be able to invest, it's going to solidify. Hopefully it's going to onshore, which would be helpful in a lot of ways to this country. And here's the surprising thing, Megan. In the past, when we have gotten extensions of production tax credits, let's say we got a 4-year extension, customers would wait until year 2, maybe even 3 before they'd start buying into that. They would defer their decisions. So you would think with that much longer visibility, you'd have that much farther out to solidify the customer. Not happening. Customers want it now. They see the opportunities now. They understand now they're in a much more competitive environment. There's a lot more competitors to what we do, so that the supply side probably will catch up. But on the demand side, customers want the product now, and they not only do they want it, and are they willing to sign up for contracts that may not come to commercial operations until 27-ish, but they want to sign up with companies who have a track record, who will actually be there when they need the product, because they're no longer doing renewables because it's socially responsible. A lot of their businesses rely on it. They rely on it for attracting capital of their own, whether or not you believe in ESG scores, they're real, and people are focused on that. And so having a reliable partner has become really valuable, and that's been something that NextEra has benefited from because we've had 20 years of history here. Last thing I'll say, and Andrew he referred to it. Look, a production tax credit is a very valuable incentive for us as a society, not necessarily the industry, because it promotes efficiency and getting better. The investment tax credit is fine, but you get that whether or not your project operates and operates according to the way you expected it when you drew it up, when you bring it commercial. The production tax credit, however, requires you to actually generate, and that's how wind has gone from a premium product when I got in this industry to something that sets the margin and is the marginal cost of energy in a lot of markets. And I have the same hope that that's going to affect, I mentioned earlier, hydrogen, that when you look at the impact that the production tax credit will have on capital rolling into the hydrogen business, I think you're going to see a curve there that will shock you in terms of when that's going to be largely commercially available.
I just have something to chime in on the IRA bill, because it was pretty fascinating to me when I was at CERAWeek, which has a lot of international folks. It's in Houston last month. And the IRA bill was a huge topic of conversation. And, you know, so much of the rest of the world has kind of sort of looked down on the U.S. for the movements and kind of our dragging our feet a little on ESG and sustainability initiatives. And that bill came out, and I realized there's a lot of concern around what's it actually going to cost us at the end of the day, and that remains to be seen. But it did leapfrog us as a country with the rest of the globe in a way that it almost angered them. And talk about this panel being green, like they're green with envy at this. You know, the visibility for investment and the speed, the certainty around some of it. And it was contrasted a lot with some of the policies in Europe and how slow they are, and they're just stick and penalty, and they're not uniform across the European countries. So it really has very big positive implications for the U.S. In terms of the rest of the world and how that's viewed.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We see them kind of hastening to develop their own Inflation Reduction Act counterpart, and it'll be interesting to see if they can get cohesive and push that through. Clean, reliable, and affordable. I remember that from our last speaker. And I'm wondering, and you started to touch on this, John, but is there tension between your customer base, right, wanting first the clean falls by the wayside if we can't get reliable and affordable, right? But then you have institutional investors who are using those ESG scores to make investment decisions that can influence capital flows to you or your competitor. So I'm wondering, are customer demands and needs aligning with your stakeholders on the investment side, or is there friction there?
I think generally they're aligning. I mean, there's always going to be friction. Yeah. There's friction in me saying real zero in this room when a lot of us are focused on net zero. I get that, right? There's always that type of friction in this whole business. And I look at it as, you know, everybody wants their technology to be the technology, but if you look at how we transport people around the world, we do it with planes and trains and cars and other vehicles. And that's really kind of how you put a system together. So specifically to your question, I think we have a lot more alignment than friction right now, and that has surprised me a bit. Yeah. But we have very large companies coming together to be business partners that were kind of retreated to their corners for decades, and this is driving us together. It's a good thing.
I want to prompt the audience to send questions our way. We'll keep going through our question list here, but feel free to send them our way or give them to the students that we're helping. So,
Megan,
yeah,
if I could jump in, clean, reliable, and affordable are three important things. But I think there's another one that's coming on, especially this in the transition, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of the incentives to electrify everything, to move to, for the last decade plus, we've seen flat electricity demand in this country and in developed countries around the world. It's even been going down. But I think that's due to change. And it's going to so adding a fourth one to that of growth, being able to grow the production, being able to continue to meet all four of those three while also seeing growth. And I know NextEra, especially in Florida, has continued to see a lot of growth. But we're going to see that across the whole country. We're going, especially in electricity grids. And I don't know that it's gotten through to the projections yet, to the energy projections, because a lot of the times what everybody does is just look at what's happened over the last decade and then just continue the graph, continue the lines out from there. But it's a real discontinuity to start adding half of the vehicle fleet powered by electricity, powered by utilities. That's a huge amount of new load. Changing from oil heat to electric heat in the Northeast. Things like this it's going to be a huge demand signal and increased load on the electric grid. That's going to be a challenge. But if you can maintain those other three things while also seeing growth, then that's kind of the way to energy security, climate stability, all those things.
We touched on this a couple panels ago, but the thought process around LNG kind of making its way from the US to Europe and Asia, and a key part of that is the investment in the terminals here domestically. And you have trouble getting the investment to FID if you don't have long-term purchase agreements in place or supply agreements in place. And so I'm curious, Tanya, how you think Project Canary can help facilitate responsibly sourced gas and even facilitate getting some of those projects to FID if the buyers on the other side of that are leaning on your certifications.
Yes. So the RSG, or certified gas, differentiated gas market, is actually one of the things I find the most exciting, because it's really talking about changing something that's been a commodity and traded and bought and sold as a commodity into something where you can actually differentiate it by taking environmental attributes that were in connection with the production and transport of that gas molecule and assigning them to the molecule and then putting a different price on that. So for companies to achieve that certification, they go through our assessment, or there's other assessments out there on the market, and then we have all this data that actually says here's the emissions footprint, here's the water usage, here's these other aspects associated with this gas. And so, yes, as we're working with Europe, this has been a huge focal point for them. In fact, we actually brought NG, which is a big French company, over to the US, and we brought them to Colorado, and we took a bunch of them to well sites out in Colorado. And these sites are like 200 feet from a really high-end housing development in Colorado, and very clean sites. I mean, they're just pristine. And Colorado has a lot of extra regulations too around air quality monitoring and things. And we walked them through, like, this is how production is actually done here in the US, and they were blown away. And they also are concerned not just with the emissions, but the European community very concerned around the water piece too. So both of those were really important, and they've now been willing to sign long-term LNG buyer agreements, putting in requirements into some of those contracts around the qualifications that the gas has to have. But it starts to unlock some of that buyer demand for us as a country. And we've seen this also with the industrial community, where they have different requirements, for their Scope 1 and Scope 2 reporting. They need to understand the emission footprint. If they're buying gas as an input, what's the emission footprint associated with that gas, so that they can report on it properly. So they're starting to really scrutinize, where are they buying from, what does it look like? And the neatest part about this is gas, a lot of times, is traded physical, kind of point to point. And we've seen this growth now in registries come up to where your physical gas molecule can go one place, but your emissions attributes can be tokenized and traded and bought and sold digitally, and get that credit to the buyer of that, regardless of where your physical gas goes. So that starts to unlock just big changes in how the gas market, can perform.
John, this is a question for you. How are you performing to de-risk the plan over the next 25 years? And how can you price risk what is ultimately reliant on the legislative cycle?
That's somebody else's problem, though. I mean, look, we didn't come up with our plan until we actually saw visibility. And one of the things, as I listened to the panelists here, is, we're not zealots as it relates to the technologies that we're going to deploy. And we haven't been. That's why we've been successful commercializing wind and solar. If something else had come along, that would have provided more benefits to our customers and more benefits to the company, we would have utilized it. So we do have, I'd say, models that show different price points, different, what happens if hydrogen doesn't materialize the way we expect. You end up with a lot more batteries. You end up with some other type of storage technology. You may not get all the way to zero, but we'll have made a big stamp. In terms of the incentives that are provided by the federal government, that's been our business for 25 years. And, we've gotten a lot more efficient, a lot better in terms of operating. One of the things that gets lost in that is that low-cost operations is still the name of the game. Everybody's getting the production tax credit in wind if you qualify for years, in solar going forward if you want it. But not everybody's project works because they don't operate it as efficiently as we do. They don't develop it as well as we do. So we focus on the areas that we can create competitive advantage, and then we fill in the gaps with the incentives that are available. And it's been a winning combination to date, and that's how we look going forward.
I like this question. Andrew, I'm going to put it to you. Decarbonization is one component of the transition, but what about land usage? And the reason why I put this to you, Andrew, is because you can talk about the scale of what could be achieved with nuclear fusion and the footprint associated with that scale. Okay, you're right with it. Thanks.
Yes. So I think maybe they were trying to get you on the scale of solar and wind farms, but let me tell you about the scale of a fusion power plant. A fusion power plant requires only the room it's in, plus all of the other accompanying stuff. The room it's in, which for instance, Commonwealth Fusion Systems, the MIT spinoff in the Boston area, their tokamak, which is a magnetic confined fusion device, is about the size of a tennis court. Then you have to build shielding around it. It does produce neutrons, so you have to protect the public and protect workers from those neutrons when it's on. So shielding is such high-tech things as concrete and water. Very, very. We know how to do these sorts of things. So you surround it in a concrete chamber, and then all of the other stuff that you need to make a power plant. Looks just like any other power plant. So we're talking things that are city block type sizes. And then the other thing that we sometimes forget when we think about power plant sites and everything and the amount of land use is you forget about where all the fuel comes from, whether it's coal mines or all the gas fields that you fly. When you fly over West Texas, you look down and see all the gas fields and those sites and everything like that. Well, fusion, the fuel, is forms of hydrogen gas, deuterium and tritium, both of which are, deuterium is widely available, can be distilled from seawater. Tritium is not available naturally on Earth, but it comes from lithium. So you will have to have lithium mines, just like the lithium that we're using in batteries and such like that. We think you can even use the lithium from recycled car batteries. So that's a potential supply chain that we're looking into and think could be valuable. So it's a small footprint, and the real thing that's important for fusion is that it enables this. I went to this before. Energy growth. It enables energy growth, and when you have abundant, clean, affordable energy, there's all sorts of other really interesting things you can do with it. You can make clean fuels. If you have a carbon feedstock, you can make all sorts of clean fuels, clean gasoline, clean jet fuel, such like that. It opens up, when we start getting further off, it opens up the rest of the solar system to getting, instead of taking a year and a half to get to Mars on a chemical rocket, with a fusion rocket, you can get there in a matter of about a month. Really important sort of kind of futuristic world things that you can start doing with it. You can desalinate water. A fusion power plant perhaps could be, if you place it in California, could be producing energy most of the time, but when the solar really kicks in, it'll then turn to desalinate water as its other value chain sort of thing, stuff like that. So it is really concentrated. Mr. Schellenberger today talked about energy return on energy invested, and put uranium at the far end. Well, actually, the one at the far end is fusion fuel, and just the ability to have, I forget the exact number, but it's 1 pound of fusion fuel is the equivalent, I think it's 100,000 pounds of coal. Just really, really important concentrated energy source.
John, the next question is, in Europe, wind is moving offshore. What are your thoughts on offshore versus onshore wind?
Yeah, we don't invest in offshore wind. We analyze it a lot. We don't think it fits in the clean, sustainable, affordable category. We don't necessarily see that as affordable. We tried 20 years ago. We tried to do the first offshore project off of Long Island, and we actually exited that contract when our capital costs doubled and our O&M costs almost doubled. I do think some offshore will be built in the Northeast. I think that's the hope of a lot of the New England states, is that they would supply much of their renewables from offshore, but I don't see it being the thousands of megawatts that are currently on the books. And I would never say never as far as NextEra, but we'd have to find a really de-risked project that made sense, and I don't see that happening.
What does the capital availability look like around your ecosystem of projects? How do you think about the ESG ratings and the influence that has on capital availability for your business?
We have plenty of capital flowing to our projects. Actually, that's, from our position, maybe we would want a little less capital flowing into our industry because there's a lot of competition that's popping up, and we have to bear with that. But, we have another publicly traded entity called NextEra Energy Partners that effectively it's a financing vehicle for mostly our projects, but they have purchased projects from others, and they provide abundance of capital for us. Tax equity and the banks in particular are our main source for wind and now solar. And, in our conversations with them going forward in a post-IRA world, we're actually worried that there's enough capital coming from tax equity to be able to sustain even our investments. But I think based on our position, we would get a first cut at tax equity available. Our customers are in a bit of a different situation because they're the ones that our ESG scores, if you look at us relative to our peers, are fine. They're trying to clean up and use us as a partner in order to do that. So I'm not concerned of capital either in the short term or the long term, and I think that a lot of these things that we're commercializing are going to attract plenty of capital.
Yeah, if I go back to 2020 when Concho was sold to ConocoPhillips touted the acquisition as something that was accretive to their emissions profile. In other words, it helped them achieve an alignment with the Paris Climate Agreement. And so it's interesting that we've seen ESG even influence M&A transactions in the traditional upstream space. I'm curious, Tanya, if you see kind of that leads to an uptick in the usage of methane detection devices and how that influences methane reporting, and if you see that also coming through in due diligence questionnaires for M&A or capital fundraising.
Yes, actually, all of that. So companies do use us, use our competitors in advance of doing an M&A transaction and making sure, number one, just having the data, again, to support whatever they are going to be putting forward in those due diligence materials. And then also getting ahead of any sort of issues. The environmental risk assessments that we do help give a buyer a really good view of what was done at that facility. We cover any spills and safety incidents and how it was designed, so they can look back and get a good history and say, well, what's the chance of risk? So it gives a lot more visibility into the assets, and takes away some of the concerns. So we see it both in terms of the seller trying to position themselves and get some good data around their assets, and then it also just helps facilitate because of greater transparency for the buyer on what they're buying.
I was going to ask too, what's harder, methane detection or nuclear fusion?
I think I'm going to give it to Andrew.
Yeah, fusion's pretty hard.
The sun thing.
But I've heard tracking methane leaks is tough too.
If there are no other questions from an audience, I thank you for joining us in this last session of the day. As Ann said, you're the true survivors of the symposium. And I know there are snacks too. I saw a gentleman come in with snacks. And so somebody that likes to eat every other hour, that's available to you. And then I think we're going to huddle again in about an hour with a report out on some of the insights from today. And so I hope that this panel was a good way to put all of that in context. Andrew, I think you alluded to this a few times. We see energy, growing, energy demand growing, not shrinking. And how do we scale not only conventional energy and run that really well, to Tanya's point, but how do we invest across the entire energy value chain in order to bring customers and consumers the energy they need when they want to turn it on. And so, again, thank you for today, and look forward to networking now.